So now we are at the final session of the conference. And by way of summary, this session is going to be devoted to the topic of lessons for effective communication of imprecise uncertainty. And we have two very interesting presentations. The first will be by David Budescu, who is in the Department of Psychology at Fordham University. And he has some results and will lead us in a discussion of cross-cultural variability in risk assessment. David.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. So I am not science communication expert nor a health science communicator, but I am working on human judgment and decision making, just like Caitlin, except that I'm doing it for longer. And the common theme of most of my work has been dealing with uncertainty. I've done work on elicitation of uncertainty. I've done work on human, individual, and small group decisions in the presence of uncertainty. And today I'm going to talk about communication of uncertainty and implication for science communication. So by way of background, let me start by explaining why I think we should be concerned about that. So uncertainty, first of all, is inevitable. Uncertainty permeates every physical and social system that we're interacting with, and therefore it touches and affects science. Uncertainty can be reduced but not eliminated. Certain facets of uncertainty can be reduced by improved measurement, improved procedure. In fact, that's what good science is in some ways all about. But in every single system, in every single context, there's going to be always a component of irreducible uncertainty. And the first point I want to make is that every communication about science, every result of every experiment, every estimation or measurement procedure, every projection from every model, since it includes uncertainty, should be reported as such. It should be accompanied by measures of uncertainty. And when you're thinking about how to do that, you have to think of the other side, namely the recipients of this information, the target audience. And there are certain things we know about that side as well. First of all, most people are somewhat uncomfortable and dislike uncertainty. Some people have even used the term certainty aversion. And I think Peter mentioned in his talk yesterday that some people don't know how to deal with it, and one natural reaction is to simply ignore it and disregard it. And so the work that I'm going to talk about today and present today, it's really about finding ways in which, through experimentation, derive ways to improve this communication to the degree that it is more effective. And when I say effective, all I mean throughout all this talk is that the target, the communication, and the communicator understand it in the same way. And if you want to think of a thought experiment, imagine then taking each one of them separately and communicate to a third party individually or independently. The third party could get the same message from both of them. And that's what I call an efficient communication. So much of my thinking about this uncertainty and communication comes from a three-way typology that Tom Watson and I derived a few years back about what are the sources of the reason people sometimes miscommunicate, misunderstand, or are confused about uncertainty. The first component is the nature of the event itself. Events to which we assign probabilities or uncertainties can be unambiguously defined, or they can be in themselves ambiguous, and I'll give you some examples later. And that ambiguous event, of course, will induce higher level of confusion. The second is the nature, the source, and the type of the uncertainty that underlies events. So we distinguish between uncertainty of at least two types, aleatory and epistemic. And aleatory has to do with uncertainty having to do being outside the people who judge them, what about natural system, market forces, and so on. And epistemic have to do with the level of the perceived level of knowledge, complete, incomplete, or unreliable information that one possesses. And I'm thinking of uncertainty also being at the one end precise, and precise means it can be quantified and basically mapped into a probability function, what in decision making called decisions under risk, and at the other end being imprecise because there's not enough information to allow such quantification. And just an example, so at one end you have the classical example of classical textbook in probability theory, rolling dice, spinning the wheel, and so on. At the other end, you have a new technology that comes on the market, and you need to set up insurance rates for possible side effect or a hazardous effect of that technology, but it's new and there's no information about it, and therefore you cannot specify or quantify the uncertainty regarding it to the same level of precision. And the third one, and that's going to be the core of my talk, it's about the language that we use to communicate uncertainty. And again, it can vary from being very precise, namely to precise probabilities, and to different level of imprecision, such as using ranges of probabilities, or using labels such as probability words, and I'm going to talk a lot about probability words. So the principle that we believe should guide communication of uncertainty is that communication should be as precise as possible, but not more precise than warranted by the evidence that is available. And another way to say it is to what we call the congruence principle, that the choice of a communication modality should match the nature of the event and the nature of the underlying uncertainty. So here's an example. The chance of an abrupt drop in the market in the near future is 0.2357. This is an incongruent statement. Why? Because this is an ambiguous event. What is abrupt and what is near future is subject to subjective interpretation. Secondly, the behavior of the market doesn't lend itself to a quantification that would be a precise probability distribution, and therefore this particular level of statement struck us as being overly precise and not going to be taken seriously, I think. At the other end, imagine taking a new deck of cards, shuffling it, and say, what's the probability of choosing a red card? And if someone says, quite high, it's going to be unsatisfactory because it's a precise and unambiguous event which can, through enumeration, quantify the probability exactly, and therefore this level of communication seems unsatisfactory and incongruent. And there's some good evidence, which I don't have time to review right now, that people are sensitive to this principle, that people, when they communicate, they choose the mode of communication to match the nature of the events. When they can choose what kind of communication they want to receive, they choose accordingly, and that people don't always want precise information. And a good example is the work that Ning Du, a colleague of mine who is an accountant, and I have done. And we have shown that when companies that are being traded on the market, they issue their quarterly forecast, they very rarely use precise projection. They use ranges of values. And if you ask people, people like them. They think that this kind of level of precision, this kind of imprecision, is more believable, more credible, and they express higher likelihood to purchase a stock in that company rather than think that they perceive to be overly or super precise. So here are some empirical findings about communicating uncertainty. If you ask people, how would you like to communicate to others? Most people, a vast majority, says, I prefer to communicate using words, natural language, rather than numbers. They are more intuitive, they are natural, they are easy to understand, and they really need a good justification for using numbers. Somewhat paradoxically, if you ask them, how do you like to receive information, they like to receive precise information. And if you ask people, well, choose a vocabulary, a lexicon of words that you want to use to make assumptions, there's an unbelievably rich choice of people are using, and so people are using different lexicons. People are words that they are comfortable with, and they vary tremendously from each other, at least in English. Not all languages are equally flexible and equally rich in that respect. And there are very large individual differences in the way different people understand different words. So my likely is your highly probable, and so on and so forth. So, but these things are not common sense, they are not easy to anticipate, and therefore they can create an illusion of communication, because you think that you and I are talking about exactly the same thing, although we understand these things differently. And one solution to this, which has been adopted by many organizations in a variety of contexts, is to develop so-called standardized lexicon, which is select a list of words, associate each one of these words with a range of probabilities, and rely on this table, on this decision aid to communicate with each other. And my results are going to be precisely about this, the use of such terms. I'm going to skip here something in the interest of time, although I really like to talk about. This is, by the way, that's the way we model the meaning of probability words for this idea of a membership function. This is the meaning of the word likely, because this function captures the degree to which each probability along the x-axis is represented by the term likely, or for other, so different words can have different signature, different probability functions. It's a very, very useful tool if you want to theorize and make predictions and model these things. But I'm not going to talk about this today. So, okay, so the first example that I'm going to talk about, most of my examples are going to be from the climate change, from the IPCC, but I don't think there's anything special about the IPCC. They are just a very, very convenient example. In fact, if you wanted to invent something that would make probability people happy, you couldn't do better than climate change. The uncertainty in climate change, it's so overwhelming and so complicated and comes from so many sources, there's nothing that can do that is as interesting and you could imagine that is better. So anyway, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC, is a body that issues periodical assessment reports about climate change. Last year it issued AR5, Assessment Report 5. There have been already the first meetings in preparation for AR6. It's going to be probably issued beginning in 4 or 5 years from now. And they have dealt with the issue of how to communicate uncertainty from their very inceptions. And not only are there many sources of uncertainty, some about the science, some about the economic activity, some about other parameters. For example, one thing that many people don't talk about is how much the effect of climate change depends on the population growth over the next 50 or 100 years. So you have to put them all together in order to summarize the overall uncertainty. But when they wrote the reports, because there are so many disciplines, each one of these disciplines has its own traditions and ways of thinking about uncertainty, and they had to come up with ways that they could all use. And beginning with Assessment Report 4 and some 4 and 5, this is what they've been using. They've been using precisely a kind of standardized lexicon of the way that I'm describing. And so if you write for the IPCC, if you're a reviewer for the IPCC, you get a document that explains to you that that's how we communicate uncertainty. This is reproduced in every report as a footnote, as an appendix, or sometime in the text to say, this is how we think about uncertainty. Notice, by the way, that this is an interesting lexicon, which this is not a partition. These are not mutually exclusive. For example, likely is greater than 66, but it's not bounded from above to be at 90. So if you think the probability is 0.93, you could say likely, you could say very likely, and that you'll be and that's by design, by the way. Okay. So what we did a couple of years ago, we wanted to see how the public understands this probabilistic pronouncement. So we ran a study in which what we did, we extracted 8 sentences from one of the executive summaries of the IPCC, 2 with the word very likely, 2 is likely, 2 is unlikely, and 2 is very unlikely. And we presented this to a large number of people, and we asked them to tell us how they understand the communication. So here's an example. This is a screenshot from our survey. It's very likely that hot extreme heat waves and heavy precipitation will continue to become more frequent. And what people need to do, they need to move these 3 sliders to find the lowest bound, the highest bound, and the best estimate, but not of what they think, but if you read the instructions, of what you think the authors had in mind. And just as a regular reader of the IPCC, if you don't remember what these words mean, you could click there to see the guidelines, and this table pops out, and then you make your judgment. And then, here's the experiment. Half the people saw this particular version, the other half randomly selected. They saw the words and the numbers combined. So the same sentence would show very likely and very likely, or immediately reminded that what very likely means in this context, and you're asked to make the same judgment. So it's really a very small, almost cosmetic change in format in the presentation. These are just some examples of the other sentences that you can get a sense of what it is that the IPCC is referring We've done this. We were fortunate enough to get NSF money. We ran this survey in 25 countries, in 17 or 18 languages, about 400 people in every country, and randomly half the people in every country. So each one of the two versions. So overall, we have over 10,000 respondents. The only reason I'm excluding here the Arabic speaker, the results are the same. There's nothing changed if you include the Egypt and the West Bank participants as well. But demographically, they look totally different. They were much more, the samples were much more 80% men and much, much younger. And so they were not in line with everyone else, and therefore I don't report them here. Okay, so here's the first result. This is how, these are people's best guesses of what. You're not supposed to move. Okay, these are people's best guesses of what these words are. So look at the very right sentence, which is very likely, which is supposed to be greater than 90%. So in principle, all the responses should have been way above the top line at 90%. In fact, you see the people estimates of what very likely means, it's really more around 75, 80. In other words, much, much closer to 50%. Look at the other end. I can move that far. Okay, very unlikely supposed to be below the 10% line, but you see that on average, people are answering things in the 20s and the 30s. So the first observation is that the public understands these results much more regressively, much more closer and less extremely than intended by the communicator. The other thing, you see how wide the distribution is. Secondly, and that may be harder to see in this one, is that in every single case, when you VN stands for verbal and numerical jointly, in every single case, that particular form of presentation pushes things in the right direction. Here's a summary of what proportion of the statements are interpreted in ways which are consistent with the IPCC guideline. And it's not impressive. I mean, it's really disappointingly low, but clearly presenting words and numbers together really makes a difference because it improves effectiveness of communication tremendously. You may ask, is this something that has to do with a particular set of samples, or is this something universal? It is universal. These are all the 25 countries listed. These are the proportion of consistency with the IPCC on the left in the control conditions, and on the right with words and numbers presented together. And although the degree of the effect, the magnitude of the effect is not the same, in every single country, words and numbers together are more effective in communication. We did a multidimensional scaling where we looked at how the closeness or proximity of distribution of the 4 words in the 25 countries. And the way, I don't have time to get into details, but essentially what you should expect to see here, it's 4 clusters. One, this is how people in 25 countries understand likely, very likely, and so on. And you see this in both conditions, but on the right, where it is you present words and number together, the 4 clusters are much, much more concise, more better separated, much less confusion. So what you take away from this slide is that using words and number together not only improves the consistency with the guidelines, it also facilitates communication. So someone who read the report in Korean and someone who read in French, they understand it better, they understand it more alike, not better, more alike when we show words and numbers together. So this is, I think, clearly a very, very strong presentation, and I'm trying to convince the IPCC to change their presentation modes, but they are by now a very, very large organization. Every decision at IPCC has to be approved by a vote of representatives from all the countries in the world, and so I'm still away from there, but I think I'm making some progress. The other thing I like about this is the following. So there's the built-in assumption that if you give the writers, here are the guidelines, they follow the guidelines, but there's absolutely no guarantee and no way of testing it. And it seems to me that if every time you write a word, you have immediately to write next to it the numbers, I think it also serves as a prompt, as a reminder to the authors to be more in line with these guidelines. Okay, the second part, the second lesson that I want to talk about really has nothing to do with anything that we can do, but it's something that I have the sense that scientists often forget when they communicate about uncertainty. Because you put so much, and namely that's the heterogeneity of the target population. Scientists put so much time, effort, money, into running their models, at least in the IPCC context, and coming up with these projections. And inevitably, they think of them as being the definitive final word. In a Bayesian sense, this is a posterior distribution that everyone should take it as it is. But when you present it to the audience has their own priors. And they will not necessarily all accept this information in the same ways. And the way we show this, again, with the same data, we also administer a bunch of surveys about people's attitudes about climate change. So these are 4 of the scales. Each scale had 5 or 6 items. These are examples of items. And so everyone had a score on this item. And if you correlate the scores with the number that they assign to the probability sentences, you see positive significant correlation, especially for the high probability words. In other words, people who believe in climate change, think it is human-made, and so on and so forth, assign higher probability to this word. And if you want to see this in another way, here is the United States sample where we break down the respondents by their self-reported political affiliation. On average, Republicans assign probabilities lower by 15 or 20 points on average to the same events than Democrats. So I'm not saying it to make fun of Republicans, although I've been known to do this before, but to make the point that the reason that they do it, it's not just because they are deniers, but because they look at the same information and they incorporate it using a different prior. They start from a different point, and therefore the reason they don't move all the way. It's one interpretation. Now, not all the way is that because the prior to which they attach this information is different. So I think that it's really something that people have to be very, very sensitive about. The understanding the heterogeneity of the population, and don't interpret the fact that people don't accept your probability assessment as they are at face value as a complete rejection of the message. You need to try to understand the context in which this happens. The last lesson I want to talk about is basically this idea of evidence-based lexicon. So you may ask yourself, how did the IPCC come up with that particular table? Why did they decide that likely starts at 66 and not at 60? Okay, I've been trying to ask this question for a long time. I haven't been able to come up with to obtain an answer. At one meeting, I asked, so can someone give me the data from which this was based? And they all started laughing. What data? And I think this is one of these examples where there's a group of 3 or 4 people, the committee who was in charge of communication of uncertainty. They sat around the table and they came up with this decision. And that's what you'll find in many, many other cases. I'll show you in a moment intelligence scales, in medicine, and so on. My wife and I are going to several hospitals in New York City, and you get results from them. Everyone has at the bottom a list that is explaining how different terms should be associated with probabilities or risk, and they are different, from one hospital to another. And so since this is done in basically an ad hoc and somewhat arbitrary and convenient by a list of committees, it may not be the best way to come up with these values. And we've been advocating that these scales should be evidence-based. And what we mean by that is that if you're going to decide to use a particular set of words, you start with these words, you administer to a sample of the people from the target population to see how they interpret these words in a natural sense, and then you find a way to determine optimal cutoff points, which are most in line with what people already think of these words to begin with. And so, Emily, this is taken from Emily's master thesis, which is now published in Behavioral Science and Policy. She's done exactly that. And for example, in this particular case, you said that on the left side, you have the distribution of judgments of the words very unlikely, unlikely, and you see they overlap. And what you do, you set up a cutoff point, basically at the point where the two intersect, and everything to the left, that's going to be the region that we are going to call very unlikely. Everything on the right is what we call unlikely. And the cutoff point is not necessarily 1/3 or some other round convenient number, but an empirically derived number from the relevant population. And so what we did, we tested the quality, how much doing rescaling thing in this way can improve communication. So what we did the cutoff using data from the American respondents, and we tested with a different sample of English speaking, in this case, the UK and the Australian sample. And if you use the rate, the table from the IPCC, which I show you, get level of agreement of 27 and 25%. But if you use one of the method, the empirical method that we tested, for the same people, from the same statement, you can almost double the level of communication from 25 to around 45 and 50. So this is really another very, very simple, very cost-effective way to improve quality of communication. Now, as I said, it's not only the IPCC. Here are the scales that are being used on the left-hand side by the National Intelligence Council, which is the director of national intelligence in Washington, D.C., and on the right hand, this is the scale that is used by the Defense Intelligence in the UK. And if you look at these two scales, it's striking how different they are. It's striking, for example, that I'm told by design, the UK has gaps in it. There's nothing there to say 50%, and it's by design because I'm told, it's all off the record, of course, I'm told that they didn't want people to answer, oh, it could happen or it could not, it's 50-50, okay? And so there's a way of manipulating people and getting on being precise. But I think what I find most striking about it, this is the United States and the United Kingdom. They are, close allies and collaborators in everything to do with intelligence for at least 100 years, and they cannot agree on a common way to quantify uncertainty in their scale. And again, so we did the same things, and again, by using a sample, we ran an experiment where the respondents were Canadian intelligence officers, and so when you're analyzing the responses, again, you see the scale that we derived empirically by setting the optimal cutoffs really increases communication to 79% of efficiency compared to only in the 50s in the other context. So there's a clear evidence here to derive, there's a clear advantage to deriving empirically based or evidence-based things. And this can, a very, very small change, very easy to implement, very cheap. It could make a huge difference, and it could be, again, tailored and catered to the various preferences and people's natural use of language, because it's extremely difficult to legislate meaning. It's extremely difficult to legislate language, to say people, beginning tomorrow morning, when I say likely, you think only 60% and higher, it's very hard, it's not going to work. So my colleague Sam Philenbaum and Tom Watson on an experiment with national weather forecasters, where in their work for predicting storms and so on, they use one of these lexicons, and they used it very well in the context of their work. If you administer a survey and ask them questions, you go to the physician and tells you it's likely that you'll have to have an operation unless you blah, blah, blah. Immediately they forget the legislated meaning of these words, and they're all over the map. They resort to their natural use of language. And so if you are going to try to legislate language in order to make communications more effective, then you have to do it in a way that will be easier the easiest for people to accept and to use. All right, so I'm just going to stop here, just to simply say that these are just, I think that in many ways I'm following the lead of Brandon yesterday when he said we need to do experiments on things that seem to be common sense, because the last thing that you can say about common sense is that it is common. People have different, it's common sense to me that that's what you should do, okay? And I think that these are just illustration how sensitivity to these very, very subtle and small points, and with the use of proper experimentation can lead to meaningful increases in communication of uncertainty. All right, so I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, David.
Could you just answer in numbers, please?
I'll do my best.
Okay.
About 50%.
Adam?
So I have a question about the scales beside the descriptions. So eyeballing it, it looked like you got a better spread as you expected to the endpoint, but that the variances didn't seem to be reduced that much within each category. So is that correct? And if it is,
there is, so the paper is out, and there is a significant reduction of error, but it is significant in the sense that you do the test, we have very large samples, and it reaches the standard, right. But it is not a very, very large reduction.
About that, how you can, because it seems like if you want to deal with interpersonal heterogeneity, that's the real problem, is that
So-
Even within the category, people are.
Well, I mean, I think that actually, no, we don't have an effective way of answering. Yeah, no. That's the true answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Finally, have you thought about ways that I mean, I find this really interesting, kind of communicating any sort of number in a way that, you know, you want everyone looking at to see not just to get the scale right on mean, but also just to get everyone on the page there.
Well, so I think the answer to doing it has to do with how large your lexicon is. For a reason that I don't know the history, the IPCC, for example, has seven categories. Two of them you hardly ever see. So one is over 99%, one is less than 1%. So effectively, they have 5 scales. If you were to derive a scale that has not effectively 5, but effectively 8 or 9, so in other words, use narrow ranges, and if you were to do it in a way which is empirical, evidence-based, I think you could improve that in that respect as well. So in the data, in the second experiment, I ran through it, but there's a comparison if you use a scale using 7 to 8 words or 5 words, and the most pronounced advantage of an empirical-based cutoff is when you have more words rather than you have fewer. Yeah.
Go ahead,
Hi,
Julia.
I'm interested in your result where it seemed like you very specifically asked respondents that here is an event that's whatever the term is, extremely likely, i.e. more than 90%. On this, now on the slide, or show us what are the probabilities. And you didn't get the answer, which is
so in other
above 90%. So do you have theories about what's going on in people's minds? Are they bad at math? Are they thinking this is a trick question? Are they thinking something else is going on? Why are they?
So I think it's a little bit of all of the above. So first of all, I think it's really quite surprising, but it's quite consistent and persistent. People have found this over the years, how comfortable people are to thinking about words that they like and the way they think about them. And it's basically say, well, trying to impose on them, even if you tell them, leads to a little bit of objection. People object to it. Secondly, there's an effect which I alluded to earlier, which is whenever you are receiving communication from other sources, you always tend to interpret it more conservatively. There's a natural way, there's a natural discounting of information. And it's not irrational, because we hardly in life ever come across a situation where we have access to forecasts from perfectly reliable advisors, where we get information that's perfect. So it's perfectly natural that we have built in some kind of margin of discounting and so on. Thirdly, I think that this has to do a little bit with the content. As much as we tell people, I don't want to know what you think about climate change, what do you think the authors of the report meant by that, people cannot totally overcome their own views and so on. So, in fact, there's about between 4 and 5% of the people who answer. It's not uniformly distributed across countries, where they responded to all the items with 100% or 0%, which is basically the way of saying, I'm not telling you what you want, the way we read it, but I'm telling you what I think about these climate change people. I mean, this is, that will destroy us tomorrow, or I don't believe a word of it. And so, luckily, now our results are totally insensitive. If you include or exclude these people, you get the same result. But I think it's a combination of these factors and maybe another one or two. Yeah.
Josh?
So on that front, I mean, there seem to be sort of two interesting suggestions here, right? One, that your base rates partially determine how you interpret the verbal labels, and then that you're also using your base rates on the beliefs to update, right, when you're getting them. So is that functionally, I mean, it actually implies that you might actually be functionally experiencing a double bias due to the sort of vague quantifiers that we're dealing with in these labels. And I'm interested in whether you think that's operating or whether you think it's likely only one of those two.
I'm not sure what you mean by double. So what are the two?
So one is that you interpret the certainty of the scientists
Yeah.
in part, right? You're saying that you might have a biased interpretation of
Right,
what
okay.
they meant by it
Right.
in line with your own belief. And then you're also using that biased interpretation to load onto what is your own belief when updating your own judgment to come to a determination of that.
Right,
And
so-
it, that it sort of implies an interesting double counting of your initial base rate in the way that you end up dealing with things.
Yeah, so what if you're saying that as in a Bayesian sense, I'm first of all diminishing the likelihood ratio of the communication, and then I am diminishing it again or adjusting it again when I'm doing. It's possible. I mean, I don't think we can infer this from this data, but I'm reminding you, or maybe you don't know, the old literature on probability assessment, Ward Edwards at the University of Michigan, in the 60s and 80s, the so-called conservatism, where they asked the question, are people Bayesian? And they're running lab experiments, urns filled with balls. You would know, I'm going to choose one of them. One is mostly red, one is mostly blue. And then every ball I'm selecting, you have to update your probability, okay? And people are Bayesian ordinarily. They adjust in the right direction, but they are conservative in their adjustment. And for 5 or 10 years, there was a huge literature. Why is that? Because they misinterpret the evidence, because they misapply the rule. And the literature died of natural causes because they could never figure out it's only one or not the other, okay? And so I think this is that's the kind of inference which is very interesting to do, but I think at the moment I can't say for sure. And I don't know how this could be done more effectively than it was done then.
Yes.
Not me.
Right.
So this is really interesting. I have a question that's it's related, but also somewhat outside the scope of specifically what you presented. One of the things that I sort of kept on wondering about was how some of your findings would map onto decision making, and so basically what happens next after people evaluate these probabilities and likelihoods. And so, for example, with climate change, sort of what risk are there differences, systematic differences, in what risk is high enough before people say we need to do something? Some people are like, I need almost certain, other people say likely is more than fine. There's a bunch of political scientists who look at risk orientation as an individual difference that might explain those differences.
Yeah.
Maybe yes, maybe no. So I was wondering if you could just sort of talk a little bit.
Okay, so I can talk about some of these things with authority because we've done experiments of this type a long time ago. In other words, we've done typical laboratory experiments of people, rating attractiveness, willingness to buy, and choose among gambles when those gambles were described either with probabilities or with words. And in that particular case, there was a slight advantage to having precise information, but not as high and overwhelming as you would expect. And this has to do with the fact that the level of precision to which people use even numbers at that level is such that basically they distinguish between 7 plus minus 2 levels of probability. And you can choose 7 words or 7 or 8 words that would have membership functions that would have clearly distinct peaks. And so in other words, unless you really put a lot of money on the table, right, the advantage of precision in that context is relatively small. It increases expected earning by between 5 and 10%. I don't remember the details. Now, how would that affect? So that's outside the laboratory and bets on $5 or $10. But if you ask about how would this affect people in the climate change? So one problem with the climate change, now I'm getting off script. I'm talking about climate change. It's extremely difficult for people to think about climate change. First of all, it's not clear to people what are the decisions that they can make about climate change that would make any difference. I was at a conference at BDRM 6 years ago. The keynote speaker was a distinguished climate scientist, and people keep asking, so what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? And he kept laughing. This is not something that will be solved by you and you, but if you want to do it, there are 2 things you can do. A, have fewer children, and B, vote for the right people. Okay, but these have nothing to do with communication. But I think it's really interesting that if you look back at the press releases that came out after AR5 was released last summer, the thing that the press covered more than anything else is that in the executive report, they moved from likely to very likely in the context of severity of the threat that climate change poses. And at least from some analysis of media that I've heard, that I've read, this seemed to have had, some impact. And, some people even think that was one of the reasons for the success or failure, not clear yet, of the Paris Agreement, that basically the awareness of the immediacy and severity of the threat is really kind of got to more people. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, if there is one. All right. Please join me in thanking David very much for his presentation.